They publicly humiliated her and pinned her to the ground, convinced she was just a woman and no one would step in. They didn't know one thing. She was a mixed martial arts champion. Watch till the end, subscribe to the channel, leave a like and support, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Ronda Rousey arrived in the town without announcing herself, without calling ahead, without any intention of being recognized. That was the point. For once, she wanted to move through a place the way ordinary people did, unnoticed, unexamined, free from the weight of expectation that followed her name. The drive had taken longer than she anticipated, the highway thinning into smaller roads, the landscape flattening into familiar patterns of gas stations, low buildings, and long stretches of quiet that only existed in places far from major cities. It was early evening, that in-between hour when daylight lingered, but shadows had begun to stretch, softening the edges of everything they touched. Her reason for coming was simple and personal, deliberately unremarkable. Months earlier, she had agreed to make a private stop at a small training space connected to a local community center, a place that worked with teenage girls who had nowhere else to go after school. There would be no press, no posters, no announcements. Just a conversation, maybe some donated gear, a promise kept. She had insisted on handling it quietly, not because she was ashamed of who she was, but because she understood how quickly attention could turn something genuine into spectacle. She had learned that lesson early and painfully. She wore plain clothes that blended easily into anonymity, a dark hoodie without logos, jeans softened by years of use, sneakers that had seen more airports than arenas. Her hair was pulled back under a simple cap, her face bare, unguarded. To anyone passing by, she looked like someone traveling through, not someone worth a second glance. That anonymity was a relief she felt in her shoulders, in the way her breathing slowed as the town came into view. The town itself was exactly what she expected, modest, self-contained, a place that believed it understood itself completely. The streets were clean but worn, storefronts practical rather than inviting. There was a sense of routine everywhere, the unspoken assumption that nothing unexpected ever happened here. And if it did, it would be handled quickly and quietly. Rhonda noticed the police presence almost immediately, not because it was excessive, but because it was confident. Patrol cars moved slowly, unhurried, as if they had nowhere else to be. The buildings bore small signs of authority flags, cameras, posted warnings that blended into the background so thoroughly they were no longer questioned. She followed her navigation app until it guided her toward a gas station across the street from the police department. She hadn't planned it that way. She simply needed fuel and a moment to check her messages before continuing on. The gas station was modest, brightly lit against the fading sky, its windows reflecting the red and blue of a patrol car idling nearby. The police building across the road was larger than she expected, a blocky structure of brick and glass that looked as though it had been designed to last, not to inspire. Rhonda pulled into an open spot near one of the pumps and shut off the engine. For a moment she sat still, listening, the faint hum of traffic, the beep of the pump activating somewhere behind her. Laughter from inside the station. Nothing unusual. Still, years of training and experience had taught her that calm did not mean safe. Calm was simply the absence of visible threat. She took a slow breath, rolled her shoulders once, and stepped out of the car. Inside the gas station, the air smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning solution. A woman behind the counter glanced up and nodded, her expression neutral but observant. There was an older man near the refrigerated section, keys still in his hand, studying a shelf as if he had forgotten what he was looking for. The television above the counter murmured quietly with local news, the sound barely loud enough to matter. Rhonda grabbed a bottle of water and paid, exchanging a brief smile with the cashier. The woman returned it, but her eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary, not in recognition, but in assessment. People who worked late hours learned to read others quickly. Rhonda respected that. She stepped back outside and leaned against her car, unscrewing the cap and taking a slow drink as she checked her phone. She had time, plenty of it. That was when she felt it. Not fear, not alarm, just a subtle shift in the air, the kind that made her lift her head without knowing why. She glanced across the street toward the police department and noticed two officers standing near a patrol car. They weren't doing anything unusual. One leaned against the hood, arms crossed. The other spoke into his radio, his posture relaxed. Still, both of them were looking in her direction. Ronda had been watched before. Often, cameras followed her movements as a matter of routine in some places. Fans stared openly. Critics watched with sharper eyes. This was different. This was quieter. The officers weren't curious. They weren't distracted. They were focused. She shifted her weight slightly and continued scrolling through her phone, careful not to appear defensive. Her instincts didn't tell her to leave, only to be aware. Awareness had kept her safe more times than she could count. She noted the patrol car's position, the distance to the station entrance, the angle of the street. Nothing set off immediate alarms. Still, the feeling remained. Across the street, one of the officers said something to the other and nodded subtly in her direction. The second officer followed his gaze, then looked away too quickly. Ronda's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She took another sip of water and capped the bottle, placing it on the roof of her car. The sky above the town had begun to darken. The last light of day stretched thin and pale. The gas station door opened behind her. The older man stepped out, pausing near the entrance as if reconsidering his next move. He glanced toward the police department, then toward Ronda, his brow furrowing slightly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Ronda caught his look and gave a polite nod. He hesitated, then returned it, walking slowly to his car. The officers across the street moved at the same time. They didn't rush. They didn't signal. They crossed the street with an unhurried confidence that suggested they expected compliance before it was ever asked for. One of them, taller and broader through the shoulders, walked slightly ahead. The other followed half a step behind, his gaze darting briefly toward the gas station windows before returning to her. Ronda straightened from the car, her posture open, her hands visible at her sides. She reminded herself to breathe evenly. Whatever this was, it didn't require escalation. Not yet. The taller officer stopped a few feet away, close enough to assert presence without technically invading her space. He looked her over slowly, his expression unreadable, but not neutral. The second officer positioned himself slightly to her right, close enough to block her path back toward the station without appearing to do so deliberately. "Evening," the first officer said. His voice was loud enough to carry, not just to her, but to anyone nearby. It wasn't a greeting, it was an announcement. "Evening," Ronda replied, her tone calm, controlled. The officer glanced at her car, then back at her face. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Ronda met his eyes without challenge. "Getting gas. Taking a break before I head out." The officer nodded slowly, as if considering this information, though his posture suggested the decision had already been made. "This area's been having some issues lately." "With what?" she asked evenly. "Suspicious activity," he said, the words vague enough to mean anything. His partner shifted his weight, hands resting near his belt, watching her closely now. Ronda felt the first true tightening in her chest. Not fear, recognition. She had seen this pattern before, though rarely directed at her personally. Still, she kept her voice steady. "Am I being detained?" The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, the faintest hint of irritation flickering across his face. "Just asking questions." Ronda nodded once. "Then I'm happy to answer what I can." The officer smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He took a half step closer, enough to change the dynamic, enough to make the interaction public. "Let's start with the car. Who does it belong to?" Ronda felt the quiet evening shift, just slightly, like a pressure change before a storm. She understood then that this was not a casual encounter. It was the beginning of something else entirely. Across the street, the patrol car idled, its lights reflecting faintly in the gas station windows. Inside, the cashier watched through the glass, her movements slowing as she sensed the tension building outside. The older man hadn't left yet. He stood by his car, keys in hand, uncertain. Ronda answered calmly, precisely aware that every word mattered now. She had walked into this town seeking quiet. Instead, she found herself standing at the edge of a moment that was about to pull her far beyond it. And as the officers continued to close the space around her, The stillness of the evening gave way to something sharper, something heavier, the kind of silence that comes just before everything breaks. The taller officer did not wait for Rhonda's answer to settle before continuing. He glanced at her car again, slow and deliberate, as if he were inspecting something already found wanting. His partner remained slightly behind and to the side, close enough that Rhonda could feel the narrowing of space without anyone having to say it out loud. It was subtle, practiced, the kind of positioning that looked casual to anyone who did not know better and unmistakably intentional to anyone who did. "I asked who the vehicle belongs to," the officer said again, his voice carrying just enough edge to draw attention. The words were simple, but the tone stripped them of neutrality. This was not curiosity. It was a test. "It's mine," Rhonda replied. She kept her hands relaxed at her sides, fingers loose, shoulders steady. She had answered the question. She did not offer anything more. The officer nodded, though his expression did not change. "Registration and license." Rhonda paused for a fraction of a second, not because she was unsure, but because she understood exactly where this was heading. She looked directly at him. "Am I being detained, officer?" The question landed between them, clean and precise. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of a pump shutting off somewhere down the row. The officer's jaw tightened. His partner shifted, boots scraping lightly against the concrete. "You're not in trouble," the officer said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "We just need to make sure everything checks out." Rhonda nodded once. "If I'm being lawfully detained, I'll comply. If not, I'd prefer to be on my way." The second officer let out a short breath through his nose, a sound that might have passed for a laugh. "That's not how this works," he said, stepping half a pace closer. "You don't get to decide." Rhonda turned her head slightly to look at him, then back at the first officer. "I'm asking for the legal basis for this stop." The first officer's lips pressed together. His name badge caught the light for a brief second as he leaned forward, just enough to make his presence undeniable. "We decide what's suspicious," he said, "and right now, you're suspicious." Suspicious. The word hung in the air, empty and heavy all at once. Rhonda felt the tension in her chest tighten, not from fear, but from the clarity of recognition. She had seen this play out in countless videos, heard it described in voices strained with disbelief. It was different when it was happening to her, when she could feel the ground beneath her feet and the weight of attention turning slowly, deliberately toward her. Across the street, the patrol car's engine idled steadily. Inside the gas station, the cashier had stopped pretending not to watch. Her eyes flicked between the officers and Rhonda, her expression sharpening with concern. The older man by his car remained where he was, keys still in his hand, his departure forgotten. Rhonda spoke carefully. "I haven't done anything illegal. If you have a reason to detain me, please state it." The first officer's gaze hardened. "I don't like your tone." "My tone?" Rhonda asked quietly. "You're being argumentative," he said. "That's usually a sign you're hiding something." Rhonda took a slow breath through her nose. "I'm asking questions. That's not a crime." The second officer glanced toward the gas station windows, then back at Rhonda. "Why are you even here?" he asked. "This isn't exactly a tourist stop." Rhonda's eyes flicked briefly toward the building across the street, then returned to him. "I'm passing through." The taller officer's mouth curved into a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "Funny. You don't look like you're just passing through." The words were vague, deliberately so, carrying an implication without committing to anything specific. Rhonda recognized the tactic immediately. It invited her to fill in the gap, to explain herself into a corner. She refused. "I've answered your questions," she said. "If I'm not being detained, I'd like to leave." The officer stepped closer. Not enough to touch her, not yet, but enough to tilt the balance of the space between them. His voice dropped slightly, though it remained loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "You don't get to make demands." Rhonda held his gaze. "I'm not making demands. I'm stating my rights." That did it. The officer's expression shifted, irritation flashing openly now. "You people always think you know the law better than we do," he said. "That's usually where things start going wrong." The second officer nodded in agreement, his posture stiffening as if preparing for something. He positioned himself more clearly between Rhonda and the open path back toward the gas station, his presence no longer subtle. Rhonda felt the perimeter close. She adjusted her stance slightly, feet planted evenly, not in a fighting posture, but in one that gave her balance. She made sure her hands remained visible, fingers spread slightly, her movements slow and deliberate. Every instinct told her that the smallest misstep could be rewritten into something else entirely. Inside the gas station, the cashier took a step closer to the window, her phone resting near her hand. She had seen arguments before. She had seen police stops. This felt different. The voices outside were too loud, the movements too controlled, too intentional. The first officer gestured toward Rhonda's car. "Turn around, face the vehicle." Rhonda's pulse ticked up, just a notch. She did not move immediately. "Why?" The officer's smile vanished. "Because I said so." "That's not a lawful reason," Rhonda replied calmly. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You refusing a lawful order?" "I'm asking you to explain it," she said. "I haven't refused anything." The second officer stepped forward abruptly, his shoulder brushing close enough that Rhonda could feel the heat of him. "Stop playing games," he snapped. "You're not in charge here." The words were sharp, cutting through the air with a clear intent to provoke. Rhonda felt the familiar tension rise, the instinct to respond forcefully flickering at the edges of her control. She pushed it down. This was not a fight. Not yet. "Hands," the taller officer said. "Now." Rhonda raised her hands slowly to chest height, palms open. "I'm not resisting," she said clearly, her voice steady. "I need you to tell me why you're escalating this." The officer did not answer. Instead, he reached out and took her wrist, not roughly, but firmly enough to make his point. It was a calculated move, designed to establish physical control while maintaining plausible deniability. Rhonda stiffened slightly, not pulling away, but making her discomfort visible. "Please don't touch me unless you're detaining me," she said. The officer tightened his grip, just a fraction. "I am detaining you," he said, though the words sounded like an afterthought, added only because they were required. "For what?" Rhonda asked. "Suspicion," he replied. "Suspicion of what?" He did not answer. Instead, he guided her toward the hood of her car, his hand firm on her wrist. The second officer moved in close, positioning himself on her other side. The choreography was smooth, practiced, efficient. Rhonda realized then that this was not improvisation. This was habit. Across the lot, the older man took a step forward. "Hey," he said, his voice tentative but clear. "She hasn't done anything." The taller officer shot him a glance sharp enough to silence him instantly. "Mind your business," he snapped. The man hesitated, then stopped, uncertainty warring with concern on his face. Rhonda placed her hands on the hood when directed, her movements slow and controlled. The metal was still warm from the engine. She focused on her breathing, on the texture beneath her palms, on keeping her body relaxed despite the pressure building behind her. The officer leaned in close, his voice dropping again. "You think talking like that makes you smart?" he said. "Out here, it just makes things worse." Rhonda did not respond. She knew better than to argue now. Words had done what they could. The situation had already shifted. The second officer stepped closer, his presence pressing in, his hand hovering near his belt. "You got anything in the car we should know about?" he asked. "No," Rhonda said. The officer sniffed the air exaggeratedly. "Smells like something." Rhonda closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. "That's not true," she said evenly. The taller officer straightened, his expression thoughtful, as if considering this new information. Then he nodded. "We'll see." Rhonda felt a chill move through her, slow and deliberate. The escalation was no longer theoretical. It was happening in real time, driven not by evidence, but by ego and control. Inside the gas station, the cashier's phone was now in her hand. She hadn't started recording yet, but she was ready. The older man watched, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the officer's hands. Rhonda remained still, compliant, her posture non-threatening. She had done everything right. And still, she could feel the situation slipping beyond the point where reason mattered. The first officer leaned in again, closer than before. "Last chance," he said quietly. "You want to make this easy or hard?" Rhonda stared straight ahead, the hood of her car filling her vision. Her voice was calm when she answered. I'm already making it easy. The silence that followed was brief, but heavy. It carried with it the weight of a decision already made, a line about to be crossed. As the officers closed in, tightening their grip and their control, the quiet evening that had drawn Rhonda to this place began to fracture, the calm surface giving way to something darker beneath. What had begun as a question had become a confrontation, and the path back to normal had narrowed to almost nothing at all. The moment did not arrive with a shout or a sudden strike. It arrived quietly, disguised as procedure, wrapped in the language of authority. The taller officer tightened his grip on Rhonda's wrist and guided her closer to the hood, his hand firm enough now to leave no doubt that this was no longer a request. The second officer stepped in, his body pressing close, reducing the space around her until the world seemed to narrow to the cold metal beneath her palms and the sound of her own breathing. Spread your hands, the taller officer said. Rhonda complied without hesitation, sliding her palms farther apart across the hood. The metal felt warmer than she expected, heat lingering from the engine. She kept her fingers splayed, her arms straight, her posture open. Every movement was slow, deliberate, designed to leave no room for interpretation. I am not resisting, she said clearly, her voice steady enough that it surprised even her. The officer did not acknowledge the statement. Instead, he leaned forward, his weight pressing into her back. Not enough to force her down, but enough to make his intent unmistakable. The second officer moved closer, his boots scuffing the concrete as he positioned himself just behind her right shoulder. Rhonda felt the pressure shift. It was subtle, but decisive. This was no longer about checking identification or ensuring safety. This was about asserting control. Why are you so tense? The second officer asked, his tone mocking. If you've got nothing to hide, relax. Rhonda swallowed, keeping her breathing even. I'm relaxed, she said. I'm complying. The taller officer's hand slid from her wrist to her forearm, gripping tighter than necessary. Doesn't feel like it. He pushed her forward another inch. Rhonda caught herself easily, her stance solid, but the movement sent a ripple of awareness through her body. She recognized this moment with absolute clarity. She had reached the edge of something that would not stop on its own. Across the lot, the older man took another step forward, then stopped again. He opened his mouth, closed it, uncertainty etched across his face. Inside the gas station, the cashier stood frozen near the window, her phone now fully in her hand, her thumb hovering just above the screen. Rhonda focused on the hood beneath her hands, on the rhythm of her breath, on the discipline that had carried her through moments far more physically demanding than this. She reminded herself that panic would only make things worse, that control was her greatest asset. The taller officer shifted his stance. You keep talking, he said quietly, his voice close to her ear now. That's usually when people mess up. I'm stating that I'm not resisting, Rhonda replied. That's for your record. He laughed softly, a sound devoid of humor. You think this is about records? The pressure increased suddenly. His hand moved from her forearm to the back of her shoulder, pushing down. Not enough to force her to the ground, but enough to make his intent clear. The second officer stepped in closer still, his presence now a wall at her side. Hands behind your back, the taller officer ordered. Rhonda paused for a fraction of a second, not in defiance but in calculation. Her arms were extended in front of her, her weight balanced forward. Moving her hands back in this position would require shifting her center of gravity in a way that could be misrepresented. I need you to give me space to do that safely, she said. The taller officer's jaw clenched. Don't tell me how to do my job. I'm asking to comply safely, Rhonda said. I don't want anyone hurt. The second officer snorted. You hear that? She's worried about us. That was when the taller officer made his decision. Without warning, he shoved her forward, hard enough that her balance broke for the first time. Rhonda caught herself instinctively, her palms sliding across the hood as her body lurched. Before she could regain full control, a heavy weight came down against her upper back. The officer pressed his forearm across her shoulders, forcing her lower. Get down, he barked. I'm complying, Rhonda said, her voice strained now but still controlled. Please don't push. The second officer grabbed her arm, twisting it back at an awkward angle. Pain flared sharp and sudden, radiating up her shoulder. Rhonda hissed softly through her teeth, not from fear, but from the sheer wrongness of it. This was not restraint. This was punishment. Stop resisting, the second officer shouted, loud enough for the words to carry. I'm not resisting, Rhonda said, louder now, aware of the eyes on them. I am not resisting. The ground rushed up faster than she expected. The taller officer swept her legs aside with a practiced motion, and Rhonda found herself driven down onto the concrete, the impact jarring but controlled enough that she avoided serious injury. Still, the shock reverberated through her body. Her cheeks scraped against the rough surface, the smell of oil and dust filling her nose. A knee came down on her back, then shifted higher, pressing between her shoulder blades. The second officer maintained his grip on her arm, forcing it up behind her, twisting until pain lanced through her shoulder and down her spine. Stay still, the taller officer commanded. I am staying still, Rhonda said, her voice tight but deliberate. You're hurting me. The pressure increased again. The knee slid upward, dangerously close to her neck. Rhonda felt the air constrict slightly, her chest compressing under the weight. This was the moment she had been trained to recognize. This was the point where compliance no longer guaranteed safety. Around them, voices rose. The older man shouted something, his words indistinct but urgent. Inside the gas station, the cashier's phone was up now, recording, her hands trembling slightly. A couple exiting the station froze, confusion flashing across their faces as they took in the scene before them. Get off her, someone yelled. She didn't do anything, another voice added. Back up, the taller officer shouted in response. This is police business. Rhonda focused on breathing, in through her nose, out through her mouth, short, controlled breaths. Panic fluttered at the edges of her control, but she forced it down. Panic would only make her movements frantic, her actions easier to misinterpret. I can't breathe like this, she said, choosing her words carefully. Your knee is too high. The taller officer did not respond. Instead, he leaned his weight more deliberately, as if to remind her who controlled the situation. The second officer adjusted his grip, twisting her arm just enough to make the pain unbearable. That was when Rhonda understood, with absolute clarity, that this would not stop unless she made it stop. She had given them every opportunity to step back. She had complied, explained, de-escalated. None of it mattered. What mattered to them was dominance, and they had decided that it would be demonstrated publicly, completely. Rhonda made her choice in silence. She waited for the exact moment when the second officer shifted his stance, when his weight leaned forward just enough to create a brief imbalance. She moved then, not explosively, not wildly, but with precise control. She tucked her chin, shifted her hips, and rolled her shoulder in a tight arc, relieving pressure just enough to create space. The second officer swore as his grip slipped. Rhonda used that fraction of a second to bring her knee under her core tightening as she rose just enough to change the angle. She did not strike. She redirected. She trapped the officer's wrist, rotated it inward, and applied controlled pressure until his grip broke completely. The taller officer reacted instantly, but he was half a beat too slow. Rhonda continued the motion, rolling onto her side and then up, her movements fluid despite the pain in her shoulder. She caught the taller officer's arm as he reached for her, using his momentum against him, pulling him forward and off balance. The exchange lasted seconds. To Rhonda, it felt both endless and impossibly brief. She moved with the discipline of years of training, careful not to escalate beyond what was necessary. She used leverage, balance, and timing, not brute force. The officers found themselves on the ground before they fully understood what had happened. Their positions reversed, their control gone. Rhonda stepped back immediately, hands raised, breath coming fast now but still under control. She did not pursue. She did not gloat. She did not strike again. Stay down, she said, her voice firm but not raised. I don't want to hurt anyone. The words barely registered. From the perspective of those who had only just arrived, the scene looked entirely different. Two police officers on the ground, a woman standing over them, strong, steady, unafraid. Phones rose higher, voices sharpened, confusion turning quickly to judgment. "She attacked them," someone shouted. "What did she do?" another asked. The taller officer scrambled to his knees, rage flashing across his face. "She assaulted us," he yelled. "She's dangerous." The second officer clutched his wrist, his expression twisted with pain and shock. He said nothing, but his silence was as loud as any accusation. Rhonda took another step back, putting space between herself and them. "I defended myself," she said clearly. "You were using excessive force." Her words were lost in the rising noise. The narrative had already begun to form, shaped by angles and assumptions rather than truth. The people who had seen the beginning were drowned out by those who had only witnessed the end. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Rhonda felt the weight of the moment settle heavily on her shoulders. She had survived the physical danger, but she understood now that something far more complex and unforgiving was unfolding around her. The fight was over. The consequences were just beginning. As the first patrol car turned into the lot, lights flashing, the quiet evening that had drawn her to this town disappeared completely, replaced by chaos, accusation, and a truth already slipping out of reach. The first patrol car entered the lot with its lights already flashing, red and blue cutting through the dimming evening like sharp blades. The sound of the siren arrived a heartbeat later, loud and insistent, forcing every conversation to stop mid-sentence. People turned instinctively toward the noise, drawn by the authority it represented. More phones rose into the air, their lenses hungry for whatever came next. Rhonda stood where she was, hands raised, palms open, her chest rising and falling faster now, but still under control. She had stepped back deliberately, creating clear space between herself and the two officers on the ground. To her, the moment was simple and precise. She had been forced down. She had protected herself. She had stopped the threat and disengaged. That was the truth as she knew it, as her body knew it, as the pain still pulsing through her shoulder confirmed. But truth she understood was already slipping away. From the angle of the first videos, the beginning did not exist. There was no footage of the questions, the taunts, the tightening of space, no recording of the shove, the knee, the twisting arm. What the cameras captured instead was the aftermath. Two uniformed officers on the concrete and a woman standing upright, strong, composed, unmistakably in control. To anyone arriving at that moment, the image told a story all on its own. The taller officer pushed himself up to one knee, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. He pointed at Rhonda as if the gesture alone could restore his authority. "She attacked us," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "She assaulted police officers." The words were loud, clear, and repeated immediately by his partner, who had scrambled to his feet and now clutched his wrist as if it were a badge of victimhood. "She's dangerous," he added. "She went after us out of nowhere." Rhonda's eyes flicked from one officer to the other, then to the gathering crowd. "That's not true," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I was complying. You used excessive force. I defended myself." Her words barely traveled beyond a few feet. The noise had grown too loud, the moment too charged. People shouted over one another, their reactions driven less by what they had seen than by what they believed they were seeing now. "What did she do?" someone asked. "Why are the cops on the ground?" another voice demanded. "She just attacked them," someone else answered, with certainty that had not existed moments earlier. The second patrol car arrived before the echoes of the first siren faded, skidding slightly as it pulled into the lot. Two more officers stepped out, hands already near their belts, eyes scanning the scene with practiced urgency. They took in the sight before them quickly. Fellow officers disheveled and furious, a woman standing apart with her hands raised, a crowd forming around them. They did not ask what had led to this. "What's going on?" one of the new officers demanded, his gaze fixed on Rhonda. "She assaulted us," the taller officer said immediately, stepping toward the newcomers as if to claim their allegiance. "Refused commands. Took us down." The statement was delivered with confidence as though repetition alone could make it fact. The second officer nodded emphatically, his earlier shock now replaced by something harder, something defensive. Rhonda felt the shift the instant it happened. The energy of the scene changed as the arriving officers accepted the version presented to them without question. The system had engaged, and it was moving fast. "I didn't attack anyone," Rhonda said again, louder this time, aware that every second mattered. I was forced to the ground. I was restrained dangerously. I defended myself. One of the arriving officers looked at her briefly, then back at the others. "Turn around," he said. "Get on the ground." Ronda hesitated, not out of defiance but out of caution. She had already felt what compliance could turn into. "I'm not a threat," she said. "My hands are up. Please listen to what I'm saying." "Now," the officer barked, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The crowd reacted instantly. Some shouted for the police to stop. Others yelled for them to arrest her. The division was sudden and absolute, drawn along invisible lines of authority and assumption. Inside the gas station, the cashier's hands shook as she continued recording. She had seen the beginning. She had seen the shove, the knee, the way Ronda had been forced down. But she also knew how easily that part could disappear beneath louder voices and official statements. The older man pushed forward again, his hesitation finally overridden by outrage. "That's not what happened," he said loudly. "They put her on the ground first." One of the new officers snapped his head toward him. "Step back," he ordered. "This doesn't concern you." "It does when you lie about it," the man shot back. The taller officer spun toward him, his face twisted with anger. "You didn't see anything," and he shouted. "You just showed up." The argument overlapped, voices stacking on top of one another, confusion growing with every second. In that chaos, the truth became just another opinion. Ronda lowered herself slowly, deliberately, turning away from the officers as instructed. She moved with exaggerated care, narrating her actions even as she complied. "I'm turning around," she said. "I'm lowering myself to the ground. I am not resisting." The words were as much for the cameras as they were for the officers. She felt hands grab her arms again, rougher this time, more urgent. She was pushed down onto the concrete once more, her chest meeting the ground with a jolt that knocked the breath from her lungs. "Stop resisting!" someone shouted. "I'm not resisting," Ronda said through clenched teeth, the irony cutting deeper than the pain. "I'm not resisting." Her wrists were pulled behind her back, metal biting into her skin as cuffs snapped closed. The pressure was excessive, unnecessary, but no one seemed concerned with that now. The narrative had already been set, and everything that followed would be shaped to fit it. As she lay there, face turned to the side, Ronda could see the phones clearly now. Dozens of them, held aloft by hands that trembled with adrenaline and certainty. She understood, with a clarity that settled coldly in her chest, that most of those recordings would never show how this started. They would show only the ending, and endings she knew were easier to judge than beginnings. The taller officer paced in front of her, performing outrage for the crowd and for his colleagues. "She's trained," he said loudly. "Professional fighter. That's why this is serious. She knew exactly what she was doing." The label landed like a verdict. Trained, dangerous, aggressor. Ronda closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. She forced herself to stay present, to remember every detail, the way his voice shook when he first lost control, the exact words he used. The moment the knee slid higher than it should have. She knew that memory alone would not be enough, but it was all she had right now. Another patrol car arrived, then another. The lot filled with uniforms, radios crackling with clipped updates that reflected the version of events already circulating. Assault on officers, suspect in custody, scene contained. Inside the gas station, the cashier's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Someone had already posted a video. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. The clip showed Ronda standing over the officers, their bodies on the ground. No context, no lead-up, just the image. Outside, the crowd's tone shifted again as people began reacting to what they were seeing online in real time. "She's a fighter," someone said with new conviction. "Of course she attacked them." Others argued back, insisting there was more to it, that something didn't add up. But their voices were thinner, less certain. Doubt did not spread as easily as outrage. Ronda was lifted to her feet and guided toward the back of a patrol car. The movement sent a sharp flare of pain through her shoulder, and she bit back a gasp. She did not want to give them anything else to use against her. As she was seated inside the car, the door slamming shut with finality, she caught a last glimpse of the lot through the window. The officers were already conferring, their heads close together, their posture unified. The cashier stood frozen near the door, her phone still raised, eyes locked on Ronda with a mixture of fear and determination. The older man argued with another officer, his gestures sharp and insistent. The patrol car pulled away, the scene shrinking behind her, the truth fracturing further with every foot of distance. Ronda leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. The physical danger had passed, but she understood now that the real fight had only just begun. What happened next would not be decided by strength or speed, but by narratives, by footage, by who the system chose to believe. And in that moment, as the car merged back onto the street and the gas station disappeared from view, Ronda knew with chilling certainty that the seconds just past had rewritten her reality completely. The patrol car smelled faintly of disinfectant and old fabric, a sterile sharpness that clung to the air and settled in Ronda's throat as the door slammed shut behind her. The sound carried finality, a punctuation mark on the chaos she had just been pulled from. The engine started, the vehicle lurched forward, and the lights continued to flash, painting the interior in alternating washes of red and blue. Each color flickered across her hands, cuffed tightly behind her back, the metal biting into her wrist with every bump in the road. Ronda leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes, not to escape the moment, but to anchor herself within it. She counted her breaths, slow and deliberate, letting the rhythm steady her pulse. Pain throbbed through her shoulder, deep and insistent, and her cheek burned where it had scraped against the concrete. She welcomed the sensations. Pain was honest. Pain did not lie. It reminded her that what had happened was real, not a distortion born of adrenaline or shock. When the car stopped, the doors opened quickly. Hands took hold of her arms again, firm and impatient, guiding her out and toward the station. The building looked different up close, larger and more imposing than it had from across the street. The glass reflected her back at her in fragments. A woman with her hands cuffed, her clothes dusted with grime, her face tight with controlled focus. She did not look dangerous. She looked tired. Inside, the air was cooler, the lighting harsher. Voices echoed off the walls, radios crackled, footsteps hurried past. Ronda was led down a short corridor and into a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor and two chairs positioned on opposite sides. One of the officers gestured for her to sit. She did carefully, her movements stiff from pain. The door closed with a dull thud, leaving her alone for a moment. The silence pressed in, heavy but brief. Within seconds, it was broken by voices outside, rising and falling in the tense bursts. Ronda could make out fragments through the walls, phrases repeated with certainty. Assault on officers, refused commands, trained fighter. Each repetition hardened the story a little more. When the door opened again, two officers entered, neither of them the ones who had first approached her. They carried themselves with the detached professionalism of people who believed the facts were already settled. One took a seat across from her, the other remained standing, arms crossed. "Do you understand why you're here?" the seated officer asked. Ronda met his gaze. "I'm here because I was falsely accused of assault after defending myself from excessive force." The officer's pen paused midair, then resumed moving across his notepad. "That's your version," he said evenly. "It's the truth," Ronda replied. The standing officer shifted his weight. "Multiple officers say otherwise." Ronda nodded slowly. "Multiple officers who were involved." The seated officer looked up, his expression neutral but tight. "You're a professional fighter," he said. "You know how dangerous you are." The statement was not a question. It was an accusation disguised as observation. "My profession doesn't remove my right to defend myself," Ronda said, "and it doesn't justify what they did." The officer scribbled something down. "You could have killed someone." Ronda felt a flicker of anger rise, sharp and immediate, but she pushed it down. "I didn't strike anyone unnecessarily. I disengaged as soon as the threat stopped." The standing officer let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Funny how everyone out there saw you standing over two officers." "Funny how they didn't see what led up to that," Ronda said quietly. The seated officer closed his notebook and leaned back. "We have video," he said. "Plenty of it." Ronda's chest tightened. "From when?" The officer didn't answer directly. "From witnesses." Ronda held his gaze. Then you know the footage doesn't show the beginning. The officer's expression flickered, just for a moment, before smoothing out again. We'll let the investigation determine that. Investigation. The word sounded hollow. Rhonda had heard it before, had watched it fail others from a distance. She wondered briefly how many people had sat in this same room, told themselves the truth would eventually matter, and been proven wrong. She was processed quickly after that. Fingerprints, photographs, paperwork. Each step carried out with efficient indifference. Her belongings were cataloged and set aside. The cuffs were removed only to be replaced later, the relief brief and incomplete. At no point did anyone ask about her injuries. Hours passed in fragments. She was placed in a holding area, the bench cold beneath her, the walls close. Time lost its shape. She listened to the sounds of the station, the doors opening and closing, the muffled conversations that stopped when she looked up. Somewhere in the building, reports were being written, statements typed out, narratives solidified. Outside those walls, the story was already spreading. In the gas station parking lot, the scene had transformed. The flashing lights were gone, replaced by the low hum of traffic and the murmured conversations of people replaying what they had seen. Phones buzzed constantly as video circulated, clipped and captioned within minutes. The most shared version showed Rhonda standing tall, officers on the ground at her feet. The comments beneath it were swift and merciless. She attacked them. She's trained. That's why you don't mess with fighters. Police were just doing their job. Inside the gas station, the cashier watched the video again, her hands shaking. She had recorded more than what people were sharing. She knew that. She had seen the beginning, had captured the moment when control turned into cruelty. But she also knew how dangerous it was to say that out loud. She closed the app and stared at the screen, torn between fear and something heavier. The older man sat in his car across the lot, the engine long since cooled, replaying the moment in his mind. He had spoken up, but not loudly enough. He had seen the way the officers' faces changed when things didn't go their way. He wondered now if his silence in the final moments would haunt him. Back at the station, Rhonda was finally informed of the charges being considered: assault on law enforcement officers, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct. The words landed with a dull thud, unreal in their certainty. "I want a lawyer," Rhonda said. The officer nodded. "You'll get one." "When?" she asked. "Soon," he replied, already turning away. Rhonda was left alone again, the weight of the situation pressing down harder now than any knee ever had. She thought of how quickly it had happened, how a quiet stop had turned into a legal nightmare in the span of minutes. She thought of how easily her strength, the things she had spent years mastering, had been turned against her. Outside the station, a different conversation was beginning to form. A longer video, posted quietly by an account with few followers, started to circulate. It did not show everything, but it showed more. A shove, a raised voice, a moment of force that did not fit the official story. It was shared once, then again, then more rapidly. Inside the station, no one mentioned it yet. The system moved forward as it always did, confident in its version, certain that the noise would fade and the paperwork would hold. Rhonda sat on the bench and stared at the wall, her jaw set, her breathing steady. She understood now that this was no longer just about what had happened in that parking lot. It was about what would be allowed to stand as truth. And somewhere beyond the walls of the station, beyond the clipped videos and the shouted accusations, the first crack was forming in the story built against her. Morning arrived without ceremony, filtered through a narrow window high above the holding area. The light was pale and unkind, exposing every flaw in the concrete walls and every ache in Rhonda's body. She had slept little, drifting in and out of shallow rest, interrupted by the clang of doors and the echo of voices that never quite faded. Pain settled deeper into her shoulder during the night, a dull, constant reminder of the force used against her. And when she shifted on the bench, a sharp flare shot down her arm. She welcomed it. Pain grounded her. It reminded her that memory was not something that could be erased by reports or statements. The door opened shortly after dawn. An officer she had not seen before stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He called her name and gestured for her to stand. Rhonda rose slowly, testing her balance, then followed him down the corridor. The station felt different in the morning, quieter but tenser. The night shift had given way to day officers, and with them came fresh eyes, fresh judgments, and an undercurrent of unease she could feel even without hearing a word. She was led into a small interview room, similar to the one before, but brighter, the overhead light humming faintly. A woman sat at the table this time, her posture composed, her suit unremarkable but precise. A legal pad lay in front of her, untouched. "I'm your attorney," the woman said as Rhonda took a seat. "I was appointed early this morning." Rhonda nodded, relief flickering briefly through her chest. "Thank you." The attorney studied her carefully, her gaze lingering on the stiffness in Rhonda's movements, the faint discoloration along her jawline. "I've reviewed the preliminary report," she said, "and I've seen some of the footage." Rhonda leaned forward slightly. "Some?" The attorney exhaled. "There's more than one video circulating now." That single sentence shifted something fundamental in the room. Rhonda felt it immediately, like a weight lifting just enough to allow her lungs to expand. "The cashier's video?" Rhonda asked quietly. The attorney's eyes sharpened. "You know about that?" "I saw her recording," Rhonda said. "She had a clear view." "She did," the attorney confirmed, "and she didn't stop." Rhonda closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. The image of the woman behind the counter, her hands shaking but steady enough to keep filming, came back to her with unexpected force. Courage, she thought, was rarely loud. It was often quiet, unnoticed, and deeply inconvenient. The attorney continued. "The video shows the initial interaction, the shove, the takedown, the knee placement. It doesn't show everything, but it shows enough to raise serious questions." "What about the official statements?" Rhonda asked. "They don't match," the attorney said simply. Outside the station, those mismatches were already doing damage. Overnight, the longer video had spread beyond the small circle it began in. It was reposted by an account with a larger following, then picked up by someone with a name attached, then someone with influence. Each share stripped away a little more of the certainty that had defined the first narrative. By mid-morning, the comments had shifted. Where outrage once flowed in a single direction, doubt began to surface. People paused the video, replayed sections, slowed it down. They noticed details that had been absent from the initial clips. The way Rhonda's hands were visible, the lack of immediate threat, the knee sliding higher than necessary, the words she spoke, calm and clear, contradicting the shouted commands that labeled her resistance where there was none. Inside the station, the shift was palpable. Officers passed the interview room more slowly now, their conversations quieter, more guarded. Radios crackled with updates that sounded less certain than before. Someone closed a door more firmly than necessary. Someone else avoided eye contact altogether. Rhonda remained in the interview room while her attorney moved between offices, speaking with supervisors, reviewing documents, requesting medical evaluation. When the nurse finally arrived, she examined Rhonda's injuries with clinical detachment, documenting bruising, swelling, limited range of motion. Each note added another layer of record, another piece of evidence that did not bend easily. The taller officer who had first accused her was called into a separate room across the hall. Rhonda did not see him enter, but she heard the door close. Time passed. Voices rose, then fell. The muffled cadence of an argument filtered through the walls, punctuated by long stretches of silence. When the door opened again, the officer emerged looking smaller somehow, his earlier confidence dulled at the edges. The second officer avoided the hallway entirely. By noon, the story outside had fractured completely. News outlets began running cautious headlines, their language carefully balanced as they acknowledged the new footage. Questions replaced declarations. Legal analysts weighed in, pointing out inconsistencies, explaining use of force standards in measured tones. Former officers spoke on camera, some with discomfort, some with anger, describing what should have happened and what clearly had not. The older man from the parking lot watched it all unfold from his living room, the television volume turned low. He recognized his own voice briefly in the background of one clip, a shout that had been almost lost in the chaos. He felt a pang of regret for not doing more. then something else as well. Vindication, tempered by the knowledge that it had taken more than his words to be heard. The cashier, now identified by name, sat at her kitchen table with her phone face down. She had given her statement earlier that morning, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. When she finished, the investigator thanked her and told her she had done the right thing. The words did not erase her fear, but they mattered. Back in the interview room, Rhonda listened as her attorney returned with measured optimism. "The charges are being reviewed, she said. "The district attorney's office is involved now." "Is that good or bad?" Rhonda asked. "It means this is no longer just internal," the attorney replied. "And that matters." Rhonda leaned back in her chair, exhaustion finally seeping into her bones. She had spent years preparing her body for impact, for resistance, for endurance. She had not trained for this particular kind of fight, but she recognized its shape now. It was slower, quieter, and demanded a different kind of discipline. Outside, pressure continued to build. Calls were made. Statements were revised. Supervisors requested additional reports. The system, which had moved so quickly and confidently against her, now hesitated, unsure of its footing. Every step forward required consideration it had not bothered with before. Late in the afternoon, Rhonda was escorted back to the holding area, but this time the atmosphere had changed. The cuffs were applied with care, then removed sooner than expected. An officer avoided meeting her eyes as he explained the delay. Another apologized quietly, not for what had happened, but for the inconvenience. It was not enough. Rhonda knew that, but it was something. As evening approached, the attorney returned one final time, her expression serious but steady. "They're dropping the assault charges," she said, "for now." Rhonda's breath caught, then released slowly. "For now? There will be an investigation," the attorney continued. "A full one. And this isn't over." Rhonda nodded. She had not expected it to be. When she was finally released, stepping out into the cool evening air, cameras waited beyond the station gates. Questions flew immediately, shouted over one another, demanding statements she was not ready to give. She raised her hand, not in surrender, but in pause. "I will speak when the process allows," she said simply. She walked past them without looking back, her shoulder aching, her body tired, but her resolve intact. The truth had pushed back today, not enough to win, but enough to prove it could not be buried easily. As she got into the car waiting for her, Rhonda understood that what lay ahead would be harder than anything she had faced in the ring. This fight would not end with a single decisive moment. It would stretch on, testing patience, integrity, and endurance in ways that left no visible scars, but demanded just as much strength. And somewhere within the system that had turned against her, cracks continued to widen, forced open by evidence, by witnesses, and by a truth that refused to stay silent. The city looked unchanged the morning after her release, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Traffic moved with its usual impatience, storefronts opened on schedule, people carried coffee cups and conversations forward without pause. To anyone passing through, the night before was already becoming just another story scrolling past on a screen. For Rhonda, it lingered in every step she took, in the tight pull of muscle when she turned her shoulder, in the faint discoloration that had begun to surface along her skin like delayed proof. She woke early, long before the sun had fully climbed, her body conditioned to alertness even when exhaustion pressed heavily against her. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by flashes of memory that returned without warning. The cold concrete, the sudden weight, the moment the air felt thinner than it should have. She did not fight the memories. She let them pass through her, examined them, cataloged them. Avoidance, she knew, only gave such moments more power. Her phone lay on the table beside her bed, silent for the first time since the night before. Notifications had slowed to a trickle. The initial storm of messages, headlines, arguments, and opinions had burned itself out, leaving behind a quieter, more complicated aftermath. She scrolled briefly, not to punish herself, but to understand where the world had landed. The tone had shifted again. Less outrage now, less certainty, more questions, more careful language. Analysts debated procedure instead of guilt. Commentators spoke about restraint, training, accountability. Some defended the officers still, clinging to the original narrative as if letting go of it would threaten something larger than a single incident. Others acknowledged what the footage had revealed cautiously, as if afraid to speak too firmly. Rhonda set the phone down and stood, rolling her shoulders gently, testing the limits of her movement. Pain answered back, sharp but manageable. She welcomed it again, the way she always had. Pain was a reminder of survival, not defeat. Later that morning, she met with her attorney in a quiet office that smelled faintly of paper and old wood. Sunlight filtered in through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The attorney spoke carefully, laying out the path ahead without drama. Internal reviews, external oversight, statements to be taken, timelines that stretch far beyond the immediacy of the moment. "This won't be quick," the attorney said, "and it won't be clean." Rhonda nodded. "I know." "There will be pressure," the attorney continued, "from every side, to settle, to stay quiet, to move on." Rhonda met her gaze. "I'm not interested in quiet." The attorney studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "That's what I thought." Outside that office, the officers involved were facing their own reckoning. Statements were being re-examined, footage reviewed frame by frame. Supervisors asked questions that had not been asked the night before. Why was force escalated so quickly? Why were commands contradictory? Why did the reports not align with the video? Each question carried weight, not because it was new, but because it was finally being asked out loud. The taller officer sat alone in a small room, staring at a blank wall, his earlier certainty replaced by something brittle and defensive. He replayed the moment again and again in his mind, not as it had been recorded, but as he had felt it. The loss of control, the shock of being outmaneuvered, the humiliation of it. He understood now, too late, that what had driven him was not danger, but pride, and pride had no place in the report he was being asked to justify. The second officer said little. His silence was not calm. It was heavy, weighed down by the realization that silence would not protect him the way it once might have. Every choice he had made that night was being pulled into the light, examined without the cover of unity or assumption. The cashier returned to work 2 days later. The gas station looked the same, but she did not. People recognized her now. Some thanked her quietly. Others avoided her entirely. She stood behind the counter and did her job, her hands steady, her eyes clear. When asked why she had recorded, she answered simply, "Because it didn't feel right to look away." The older man drove past the station once, then turned back and parked. He sat there for a long moment, watching cars come and go, replaying the memory of his own hesitation. He had spoken, but not loudly enough. He understood now how easily truth could be drowned out by confidence and uniforms. The next time he promised himself he would not measure his voice so carefully. For Rhonda, the days that followed settled into a new rhythm. Physical recovery blended with preparation of a different kind. Meetings replaced training sessions. Statements replaced sparring. She spoke when it mattered and refused when it did not. She learned quickly which questions were asked in good faith and which were designed to provoke or diminish. When she finally did speak publicly, she chose her words with the same precision she brought to any fight. She did not dramatize what had happened. She did not reduce it to slogans. She described it plainly, calmly, without embellishment. She spoke about compliance and escalation, about how quickly control could become punishment when unchecked. She spoke about the danger of narratives formed without context and about the responsibility that came with power. She did not ask for sympathy, she asked for accuracy. The response was quieter than the initial outrage, but it was deeper. People listened. Some argued, some learned. The conversation shifted again, less about her strength, less about her fame, more about the systems that had allowed the situation to unfold the way it did. Months later, when the investigations concluded, the findings were detailed and unflinching. Policy failures, training gaps, decisions made in anger rather than assessment. Consequences followed, not all of them as severe as some had hoped, but enough to mark the incident as something more than a footnote. Rhonda read the final report alone. Late one evening, the room lit only by a lamp on the table beside her. She closed the file when she finished and sat quietly for a long time. The fight had not ended in triumph. It had ended in clarity, and that, she understood, was sometimes the most difficult outcome of all. She returned to training eventually, her body healing, her movements regaining their familiar fluidity. The ring welcomed her back without judgment. It was honest in a way few places were. Strength mattered there, but so did discipline, restraint, and respect. The balance felt familiar again. Yet the night at the gas station never fully left her. It stayed with her as a reminder, not of vulnerability, but of responsibility. She knew now how easily strength could be reframed as threat, how quickly defense could be rewritten as aggression. She carried that knowledge forward, not as fear, but as awareness. The world moved on, as it always did. New stories replaced old ones. New arguments demanded attention. But beneath the noise, something remained changed. A moment had been recorded. A narrative had been challenged. A truth had been forced into view long enough to leave a mark. Ronda stood one evening at the edge of a quiet street, the city settling into night around her. She took a deep breath, feeling the air fill her lungs freely, without pressure, without restraint. The fight she had not chosen had shaped her in ways no training ever could. It had tested not her strength, but her steadiness. And as she turned and walked forward, leaving the echoes behind her, she understood that survival was not just about standing your ground. Sometimes it was about standing long enough for the truth to catch up. If this story mattered to you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Watch our other videos for more stories that challenge power and demand accountability, and share this video with someone who believes the truth should never be ignored.